Now, for a further take on these developments, we have with us Professor Yang Jun-sok from the Catholic University of Korea. It's good to have you here with us.
Happy to be here.
So this arrest has been quite shocking, especially considering the timing. This comes right after what we thought was going to be a new leaf in the China-US trade war. I mean, what is your reaction to this latest development?
Okay, as the report just said, it's a bit surprising because she seems to be such an important person in the Chinese industry. She is the CFO of one of the largest Chinese companies and one of the most internationally well-known Chinese companies. And she apparently is considered an heir to that company once the current management retire. So it's a very surprising picture. But on the other hand, I'm not sure whether this could be because of the trade dispute. The story mentioned that the reason that she was arrested was because the Huawei was suspected of avoiding the sanctions to Iran. So rather than the trade side, I'm wondering whether U.S. is trying to pressure the Chinese government to maintain sanctions on North Korea. I think that's a more direct comparison than the trade war. But still, it is a shocking event, and I think the stock market reactions are not surprising.
So from what you're saying there, do you think this is just a case of possibly bad timing even?
I think so. The U.S. news reports that I've been reading seems to say that the Meng Wanzhou seems to have avoided traveling in the United States, and the Department of Justice do have evidence that Huawei has been avoiding or breaking the sanctions in Iran. So they may actually have some evidence on this, and the Huawei may actually recognize that. That's why the Ms. Wanzhou avoided traveling in the United States, apparently. But we'll have to see the evidence once it comes up.
Yes, we don't have an official word on the reasons of her detainment, but we'll have to see how that turns out. But Beijing has obviously, unsurprisingly, reacted strongly to this arrest, describing it as even a violation of personal human rights, and has called for her immediate release. I mean, what is China's reaction, say about this situation? I mean, what are the dangers here?
Okay, I think that's a standard reaction when anybody famous or important in business gets arrested in other countries. You have to say something. So we won't know any further how seriously China takes this until they go beyond complaining by the Foreign Ministry. On the other hand, my personal feeling is that China knows that whether Ms. Wanzhou is guilty or not, she is relatively a small player in this big trade war. So I think they're going to try to keep the trade war and the Ms. Wanzhou's problems separate, at least for the time being. But obviously, it's not going to make the negotiations any easier.
Well, as we mentioned, this incident comes right at this critical time when Trump and Xi Jinping met in Argentina and agreed to this 90-day reprieve, temporarily halting all new tariffs while they continue discussions. I mean, this was considered the first step towards perhaps the end of the trade war even. I mean, how significant was this 90-day hiatus of the trade war?
Okay, well, at least on the U.S. side, all the people who have analyzed the meeting seem to think that nothing really that much happened. There is a lot of hope that perhaps the problems will be worked out, but if you look at the technical details, there actually weren't that many. Both sides apparently agreed that they would delay putting on any new tariffs or higher tariffs for 90 days, but then after 90 days, we'd be stuck with the same problem. Now, there has been some rumors that China has offered some concessions. They would buy more American products. They would protect IPR better than they had been, and they would give more leeway to American firms working in China, but none of the details of that has really come out yet. So most analysts have said that they just punted the problem down 90 days, and as a price, maybe China gave some light concessions. And then things have gotten a bit more nervous because, well, the details that were revealed in Chinese domestic press seem to be different from what President Trump trumpeted on his Twitter, and then the White House officials, the people who are really doing the work, seem to be underplaying the expectations, while President Trump has been playing up the expectations. So there may have been some cross signals going there. And then President Trump put USTR Lighthizer in charge. He's known as a very hard negotiator, a hawk concerning to China. So everything is now sort of back to ground zero. We don't really know what's going on. We don't know what the details are. All we know is that the problems have been delayed for 90 days.
But you mentioned some concessions that China reportedly have made there in the U.S., the media have mentioned. But then Beijing, has actually taken some steps, visible steps as well. For example, they've introduced a new set of punishment measures, which punishes Chinese companies who violate intellectual property laws. I mean, this was a key issue that the Trump administration have talked about with involving China. So was this gesture a surprise, and how big a concession was this gesture?
Okay, I think it's inevitable. They would have to at least play at harder IPR protection. Problem is whether they'll enforce it or not. If they do have harder set of rules, but it's not being enforced, then it's not really doing much. If you remember, Korea also had a lot of problems with the United States on IPR protection as well. And what they continually demanded was not only harsher IPR protection laws, but also implementation and actual policing of those rules. So we'll have to see whether China will continually enforce those IPR protection. But I think one of the bigger problems is, will China actually carry out a lot of hard reforms that the U.S. wants, hard concessions that the U.S. wants, or whether both sides will agree just to paper over it. They change names of some of their policies, they change some laws, but do not really enforce, and whether the U.S. side will be satisfied with it. Some of the policies which are involved, I think, are very important for Chinese, so they might not be welcome. They might not welcome harsher enforcement of what the U.S. wants.
If we bring it back to the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, with the announcement, the global stock markets were hit quite hard. I mean, there was plunges in the Asian markets and the European markets. The US as well saw big falls, but then obviously they recovered as well. But this kind of roller coaster reaction, I mean, does it show how fragile the world is viewing this US-China hiatus truce at the moment?
I think so, because nothing has really been written down and no problems have really been solved. It's just been punted down 90 days. So I think it is very natural that the international finance market is nervous about this. But having said that, though, I think they may have overreacted a bit because, well, Huawei is a large company, but globally it's not that large. And I think both sides are very nervous at the moment because not only the trade war, but the whole global situation is at a very delicate stage right now. The U.S. seems to be slowing down in its growth. They may even have a recession in 2020. Chinese economy has been slowing down for years. And then the EU economy, which seemed to have been doing well until earlier this year, now is expecting to slow down. IMF has estimated that the global growth rate will fall. So I think we're in a very nervous situation right now. We haven't fully recovered from the 2008 global economic crisis. We thought we were on a solid way of recovering from that finally this year, and now this happens. So I think the international investors are really very, very nervous.
I mean, especially as we don't know what's going to happen with Meng yet. I mean, if she's currently in Canada, if she really does get extradited to the US and it becomes a more serious matter, then the markets could react again further, right?
I don't think so. I mean, markets will react, but fundamentally, if you look at the problems of Huawei company in particular, how important is she to the company? She is the chief finance officer, but frankly, there's other officers in the company. There's other people that can come in as a CFO. In an Asian sense, she's a family member of founders, so that gives her problems some extra weight. But in terms of global economic condition, if you just look at the Huawei company itself, I'm not sure if they're large enough to cause a big trouble in the market. I think it's more a symptom of international nervousness than anything else. It also depends on whether China will take this as a threat that U.S. gives during the trade war. And as I mentioned before, I don't think so. I think China will prefer to keep these two problems separate. If there's any signal here, I think because it deals with Iran sanctions, if there's any signals here, it may have something to do with North Korea sanctions.
Interesting. This whole trade war between the U.S. and China, I mean, perhaps there was this hiatus because Trump's policies are having a mixed bag effect, shall we say. So one of Trump's main arguments for starting the trade war was to reduce U.S. trade deficit, especially with China. But figures just announced by the U.S. say that so far it has gone the opposite way. I mean, the overall U.S. trade deficit for October is set at a 10-year high, with a trade deficit with China at an all-time high. What does this show exactly?
Okay, I think it shows that President Trump perhaps does not understand macroeconomics. I think most macroeconomists were not surprised by the trend, by the numbers itself maybe, but not the trend. Traditionally, current account and trade deficit depends a lot on government deficit, savings rate, and investment. And in the U.S., U.S. traditionally has low savings rate, and because of President Trump's tax cuts made last year, implemented earlier this year, the U.S. Government deficit has been estimated to grow quite a bit in the next few years, including this year. And then U.S. economy has been recovering, so their private investment has been rising. Given that situation, the current account, the trade account, has to go up. So I think it just reflects that macroeconomic condition. Now, if you look at the Chinese U.S. numbers in particular, a lot of what happened, I think, in the earlier part of the year was that a lot of American importers accelerated their imports from China because they wanted to import products from China before the tariffs kicked in. And because China is such a large exporter globally, some of the American companies cannot find alternatives so quickly. So I think that's what's driving the Chinese bilateral trade surplus with the United States in the last few months.
Okay, and finally, just to wrap things up, you mentioned a few things already, but what's next for the U.S.-China trade war, especially after this latest incident with the Huawei executive?
Okay, the really frightening thing is, after 90 days, I think we are just going to return to the same situation that we had before. President Trump wants both smaller trade deficits and more manufacturing production in the United States, and I'm not sure if that's achievable. To that front, President Trump has requested a lot of things from China, not only IPR protection, which they might be willing to grant, but scaling down of their Made in China 2025 program, scaling down of their One Belt, One Road program. And I think China looks at those type of programs as their long-run growth paradigm. So perhaps they'll get rid of the Made in China 2025 program, but they'll maintain a lot of elements from it. If the United States is going to be satisfied with that type of cosmetic changes, I think the trade war will be over with some concessions from China. But if the United States really wants fundamental changes in China, we're going to have the same problem in about in the next March.
We'll have to see how that turns out. Well, it's always fascinating to get your insights on everything. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.